first introduction is Dr. Luke Roy. He's with Auburn University, control of bullfrogs and their tadpoles on their farms. And so, Luke, you should have the option to go ahead and share your screen and get started. I will
Yeah.
turn my video back on when there's about 3 or 4 minutes left if you haven't finished up.
All right. Can everybody see that screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Matt. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a associate extension professor with the School of Fisheries, Aquaculture and Aquatic Sciences at Auburn University in Alabama. Previously, I was at University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff for about 4 years as an extension specialist, and that's where some of the work with bullfrogs and tadpoles that I'm going to talk about today was done. That's actually where Matt Smith and I crossed paths there at the same time for a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about controlling bullfrogs and tadpoles on fish farms, which might be a little bit different than some of the topics that other folks are discussing. Mainly culturing and hauling bullfrog and tadpoles. In Arkansas, they're the main producer of bait fish in the U.S. and also one of the main sport fish producers as well. And because of this, they ship a lot of tadpoles to other states. A lot of fish to other states, and tadpoles can end up in the shipments. And in states where tadpoles are listed as invasive species or bullfrogs, that can become a problem. So in Arkansas, most folks aren't trying to really grow tadpoles. They're trying to get rid of them. So that, just keep that in mind with this talk. So I'm going to get started here. Bullfrogs are typically the most common frog species that are found on commercial fish farms in the Southeast, not just in Arkansas, but if you were to come to Alabama, they'd be a common species as well. We all are pretty familiar with them. They have a very large size. They thrive in aquatic pond environments, but they do need water to reproduce, and so that's why they really like to kind of locate on ponds. Females are capable of laying pretty large clutch sizes, up to 40,000 eggs per clutch in some cases. And in the South, where I'm at, I'm not sure what it's like up there in Ohio, but down here, females are capable of having up to 2 clutches per year. So if you add all that up, that's a lot of potential for tadpoles and ponds. And as most of us learned, in grade school, since tadpoles and bullfrogs are such a good teaching model, we all know that tadpoles differ in several ways from adult frogs, including what they eat, how they breathe, and how they kind of get around. But these kind of differences in life history between the two stages really serves to help reduce competition between adults and tadpoles that are actually in the same pond, particularly for resources such as food. And another thing that's worth noting is not all, depending on when they're born, not all tadpoles will complete metamorphosis in that same year that they are hatched. And so they have to overwinter in ponds. Tadpoles, I have a picture on the left. As I mentioned, they eventually grow limbs, develop lungs, and their tails recede. We're all aware of that through that process of metamorphosis. But it's kind of interesting because tadpoles start out really super small, but then they get really big. So for farmers that are trying to control them, these different sizes of tadpoles can present different challenges as they move up towards adulthood. Within aquaculture, because tadpoles have been a problem, it's one of those things that's been studied. It hasn't been studied too extensively, but there was a large survey in the early 1990s that was carried out in a couple states in the South, Florida and Arkansas. And through that survey, farmers noted that they considered tadpole, infestations to be a serious problem on their farm. Among some of the problems that they listed was competition between tadpoles and the fish they were trying to raise for resources, particularly food, since tadpoles can eat fish food, and difficulty with harvest and post-harvest sorting and grading were also noted in that survey. And within the aquaculture circles, tadpoles are most problematic probably for folks that are producing bait and ornamental fish species like the smaller fish species, because they can kind of get in the way with the same. They might be the same target size as what some of the producers are raising their fish to be, so that causes problems. Under optimal conditions, there's been reports of tadpole production in fish ponds up to 2,000 pounds per acre. That's a lot of tadpoles. Of course, that's in the South where it's warm, has good conditions. I'm not sure if you guys would see that up in Ohio or not, but one farmer that called me with a problem when I was in Arkansas, he was out in one of his fish ponds at night with a light, and he shined it, and it was a decent size, pond. I think it was a couple acres in size, and he said every square inch of it had eyeballs of bullfrogs, and so he referred to it as a biblical plague in his in his pond. Said it was that's an extreme situation. Now, farmers that are raising predatory fish, particularly largemouth bass or catfish, they don't typically have issues because a lot of times, if they're raising food fish size, not stockers, but food fish size, they'll eat a lot of the tadpoles and things like that. So why are tadpoles a problem? I mentioned they consume commercial feed that's intended for fish. They interfere with the post-harvest sorting and grading. That's where it kind of really becomes a problem when fish are brought into vats such as this. This is a goldfish farm, but if you can imagine, what if you had maybe 100 tadpoles in that vat, and that shipment was going to a state where tadpoles are not or illegal, or bullfrogs are illegal. You'd have to go through that. So that causes problems, because they're very difficult to detect, particularly the small ones. And in the South, where I'm at, they're most problematic, in the spring when you have the abundance of the really small tadpoles being super high. This is just showing you, this is a bait fish farm in Arkansas. It's actually a big farm. This farm has about 1,100 water acres and the ponds are relatively big, but as you can see, they harvest these ponds and concentrate the fish, and then they'll kind of get them out and seine when they're scrapping the pond. If they're just doing a partial harvest, they might run a seine across the whole pond. But if they're draining the whole pond, they'll concentrate the fish into that and then seine that smaller section to load it to the truck. And sometimes this is what you see, and this isn't really what you want to see. But this is a harvest of fathead minnows at a facility, and you have more tadpoles in the seine than you have the fish that you're trying to raise, and that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, in Arkansas, where we're trying to raise some of these species. The adult bullfrogs present a different problem. They can cause some economic loss by consuming fish. A study carried out in Missouri a while back documented that excuse me, in a couple of different pond types, in a goldfish pond, a bullfrog could eat 2 goldfish and then up to 3 bait minnows in just one meal. And if they have 60 meals during their active season where they're out and about, if you have a bunch of these, it's going to cause an economic loss to your facility. So that kind of concludes kind of just my introduction of why farmers in Arkansas and some of these other states here in the Southeast that are raising bait fish and small sport fish species and shipping them all over the U.S., why they're trying to control tadpoles specifically. One of the farms that I worked with when I was in Arkansas, that shipped to Hawaii, they actually in a shipment accidentally, I think there were 6 like real super small tadpoles that ended up going in a box of fish to Hawaii, and they were discovered, and the farmer had to pay, I think it was $200 per tadpole as a fine, so 1,200 bucks, and then also they refused to even dispose of the tadpoles in Hawaii, and he had to pay the shipping of the dead fish and the water that the fish came in back to Arkansas. And that's actually why, one of the reasons why we kind of started looking into this more formally. We developed like an extension fact sheet on this to try to help farmers come up with solutions. So it can be a problem, but there are ways to try to control it, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. One of the ways that farmers try to control tadpoles and bullfrogs is by reducing their habitat. And you can see in the picture, when you have a lot of grass or weeds, vegetation on the edge of the ponds, I mean, that's prime habitat for adult bullfrogs, tadpoles, and also, where they can lay their eggs. So chemical and physical control of this type of vegetation can make them more susceptible to their natural predators, which are, snakes and birds. And in Arkansas, we got a lot of snakes and birds too, and they do help, trim back the population. But, it makes it easier if you don't have this vegetation. So mowing the pond levees also helps to reduce the habitat specifically for the adult bullfrogs. Now getting into the grading, when fish are harvested, a lot of times at a commercial facility or even at a state fish hatchery, they're harvested outdoors in the ponds, and then they're brought in to the vats. And I showed you a picture of a goldfish vat. Depending on the size of the farm, they might have a number of these vats that they hold fish in prior to sale. And then, they'll have trucks come in and they'll load them out. So it's at this stage that it becomes important to get rid of the tadpoles. So what they'll do is they'll grade the vats following harvest to separate the different sizes of fish and sometimes moving around. But in some cases too, when they're doing this, they'll do their best to try to remove the tadpoles as well. And farmers have found that a number 32 or number 40 grader work pretty well to do this. They're not very effective for the extremely small tadpoles that can go through that grader size, but for most of the ones, tadpoles that are brought in, it works. You can see in this particular picture, this is a farm that's brought in some largemouth bass, fingerlings. It's a sport fish farm. They sell fingerlings to stock out recreational ponds. And you can see in this picture, the farmer just reached in and pulled out a handful, and there's only 2 bass that, in that handful, and the rest are just tadpoles. So it can definitely, if you don't want them, they can be somewhat problematic. So a lot of effort and time, labor, and money is spent to try to remove tadpoles from some of these farms that are shipping fish to different states. And just for example, I know a farm in Arkansas that ships to 39 different states. And so, there's certain states that, depending on what the regulations are, they have to, if they're going through a state that completely outlaws, bullfrogs, they get caught with one, they're faced with a tough situation, fines and whatnot, or worse. So here we have a worker that's, he's basically going through painstakingly slow process and sifting through, removing the tadpoles from this vat of largemouth bass. A visual inspection is very important. For the example, for instance, that I mentioned about Hawaii, for small shipments, 1 to 3 pounds that are transported via ground or air freight. So if these fish that are in this net are going to be shipped, the farmer has to pay somebody to go through it and make sure there's no tadpoles. And, you know, if the real small tadpole, I mean, it's a painstakingly slow process, and you have to pay somebody to do it. But it's something that's very necessary, and it's actually pretty effective. You know, if you have somebody trained to find tadpoles, and this is technically done after the grading techniques have been used as a final step before shipping out the shipment of fish. Here we have, this is another sport fish farm, and we have a vat here, and you can see the truck in the back where fish, you know, were harvested and dumped into this vat to be held prior to sale. And you can see these vats are, you know, run as flow-through systems, you know, typically with well water. Although some farms might choose to use, you know, reservoir pond or something like that, but typically it's well water to keep it clean. And they've noticed that tadpoles will often congregate at the bottom of vats in the corners. And since these systems are operated flow through, there's a little bit of current associated with them. And the current serves to kind of push the tadpoles from one end, like where you see the front of the picture where the water's coming out, the tadpoles would get pushed to the opposite end. And they not only get pushed, but they also will actively swim away from a current. They don't have fins to try to slow them down like fish do, or stop, you know, when subjected to a current. So if you have somewhat of a current in there, they'll get pushed to one side, and sometimes they're easier to control. Those are kind of the what I call, we kind of labeled as practical control measures. We also have what's known as some of the other, we call them other control measures that aren't necessarily as effective. Some can be expensive or very time consuming. This particular one can be effective if you have a small farm. Now, some of the farms that we work with in Arkansas, you know, I mentioned that one farm with 1,100 acres, but we have farms that were over 2,000 water acres. And, you know, when you have a farm that big, you know, it's very difficult, depending on how many employees you have, to go around and do lethal control. But you can eliminate the egg masses, you know, remove them from ponds, or apply, you know, maybe a chemical to them to try to knock them out. The farmers also in Arkansas, in the area, central Arkansas, where I lived, there was a huge culture for eating frog legs. And, you know, actually there's a hunting season for bullfrogs that's used by recreational hunters. So the farmers would allow hunters to come onto their property to frog gig, you know, during the allowable hunting seasons, to try to trim down the population during that time. There has been some work done with salt, but the studies that I read, my colleagues read, you know, the results are kind of mixed. Some frogs hate salt, but unfortunately, bullfrogs, you know, they got that kind of thick, leathery skin that, you know, they're more tolerant to salt than a lot of other ones. So it takes kind of a really high concentration. Chemical treatments, formalin has been known to work. There's a couple studies out there with different doses. But it really depends on the size of the tadpole. You know, once a tadpole gets a little bit bigger, you have to use quite a bit more formalin for control. I mentioned that some farmers do, you know, apply maybe a chemical treatment of some sort to the egg mass to try to control them as well. And you know, there's been even some efforts, believe it or not, at electroshocking, try to develop backpack electrofishers with, you know, adapting the frequency to target frogs. And it's actually, you know, can be effective, but it's extremely time consuming. You know, it's only effective if you concentrate on one pond for a very long time. So because of the amount of time and effort, farmers haven't tried to do this. So I'm going to kind of leave a few minutes for questions, but I wanted to summarize real quick. The effective control of tadpoles on fish farms and also bullfrogs, it is very challenging for a lot of producers. And it's not only challenging, it's expensive. They definitely represent a very real problem for a certain group of farmers here in the U.S. And we realize there's a market for tadpoles, and there's people raising them. But for the group of farmers that I worked with when I was in Arkansas, they were trying to get rid of them. And so, the strategies that we came up with were, through the literature and also through interviews and talking and going to farms and talking with them about their problems and what they were doing to help solve them, to prevent some of these economic losses that we're seeing. So adoption of these practical control measures can help, control some of the bullfrog and tadpole populations on fish farms. And I will note from interviewing farmers and talking about this, that no method is 100% effective. So if you're looking for control, you have to use a combination of some of these practical control measures, and maybe even some of the other measures I mentioned to achieve some type of control. This talk was based off of a extension fact sheet that we developed in Arkansas. It's available online. If you type control bullfrogs and tadpoles on fish farms in Google, it usually pulls it up. But the link, there's a web link there and a reference to it if you're interested. I don't know, Matt, do we have time for any questions?
Absolutely. Thanks, Luke. We do have a couple minutes here. We've got 5 minutes here. Luke, do you want to go to that next slide and show your contact information if anyone wants to take a picture of that or write it down?
Yeah, feel free if you have any questions or want to chat about anything I've talked to, feel free to shoot me an email. And I have my facilities website up there as well.
So Luke, we do have one question here from Vipa asking about any diseases that they may carry that can then be transferred to the primary product, so the fish that's in the product.
I'm not really sure about that question. I'm not really sure whether or not, I certainly, when we were interviewing producers, they never really mentioned anything like that. I'm personally not aware of anything, but I'm not a disease specialist. But I know, at least with the farmers that I worked with, when kind of putting this document together, they never really mentioned any kind of issue as far as transferring, a pathogen from a frog or a tadpole to their product.
Thanks, Luke. And they're both cold-blooded. So I think rather than diseases, the biggest things would be what you've already talked about, was just it's very labor intensive, it's expensive, and it's very stressful on the animals, on your primary product, the fish, to try to say one tadpole, one fish, one tadpole, one fish. And so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I just had another comment. We used to have in one of our little ponds, it was only like a 10th acre, I would easily harvest 50 or 60 full-size adult bullfrogs every year from that little pond. And then great blue herons discovered that pond. I haven't had bullfrogs in serious numbers for 7 or 8 years. I mean, it's one of those things that for bait ponds, great blue heron probably have little impact, but if farmers are getting rid of those as well as the cormorants and things like that, it might make a significant impact because we've seen firsthand how, because as I understand, both frogs in general are pretty much a preferred food, even to trout.
Yeah, and the farmers do actively harass fish-eating birds like herons and egrets and cormorants, things like that from their farms, because they do eat fish as well. So yeah, it's kind of a tough call, for the farmer to make. But most of the time, if they see a fish-eating bird, they are gonna harass it to get it out of their pond. But that, you're right, that is going to reduce the bird's impact on the frog or tadpole population.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that, Dave. All right, I haven't seen any other questions, and Julie hasn't come unmuted, so I think we're still good to go. Luke, I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen, and we'll go ahead and move on with the next presentation, which is myself.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Okay, everybody, I think I'm good to go. All right, so obviously and I think it was important to talk and to bring Dr. Roy in, let him chat about how to control tadpoles, because so far that's mainly what Ohio has really needed to do due to the regulations. But we have had some changes in regulations to where we are obviously looking at culturing these animals now. And that's why most of you guys are here. And we are going to be definitely hearing from Kevin Kayle with the Ohio Division of Wildlife a little bit later on. Of course, I want to thank, there's several sponsors and a lot of farms who are engaged in this presentation, but certainly thank the OAA for deciding to start these virtual Saturdays with OAA. If you didn't know, today, this weekend is supposed to be the Ohio Aquaculture Association annual conference, which of course didn't get to happen this year because of the coronavirus. But we are going to be doing these once a month, and certainly hope that you continue to enjoy the presentations. Next month, we'll actually be on recirculation aquaculture systems. We haven't really started getting that agenda together yet, but we would love to see you and chat with you on that. So Luke was talking about getting rid of them. We need to talk a little bit about bringing them in or culturing them. So as far as my experience with tadpole or frog culture, really none. Luke talked about how we worked together in Arkansas for a while. And so certainly I saw a lot of the same problems that he already mentioned. Again, everything he's talking about is how to get rid of these animals. And that's what my experience was. Nobody's doing this really on purpose. South America and Asia are really going to be your two primary regions that are culturing these animals on purpose. And it's very rarely to the tadpole stage unless it's treated more as a hatchery side. Of course, it's going to they're of course going to adults because of, as Luke mentioned, because of the frog leg market, and not just the legs, but a great frogs do yield a tremendous meat ratio on the animals. And the only really quote unquote farm that I've been into has just been an extremely small one in Vietnam. So my experience that I'm going to talk about here, as far as actually culturing them, is just going to be resources that I've been able to dig up and read about to help present things here today. We are going to mostly talk about tadpole production because that's most likely the primary interest of the freshwater farms, the Jones fishes. That's what they would be interested in purchasing. And then of course, so that's what a lot of folks are going to end up growing. If you are serious about culturing, though, for sure, reach out to me. My information's there at the end. I'm extremely easy to find. I know most of you who are here already, but would love to chat with you. So first thing I do want to note is that this big graph that you see here, you don't have to read all of it, but this is the last USDA census of aquaculture put on by the National Ag Statistics Service. It is under miscellaneous aquaculture, and there's not a lot of information there, but frogs and tadpoles are both listed. So frogs, what's listed there are about 9 farms. And so if you scroll on over to the sales, that's 1,652 times 1,000. So about $1.65 million sold in frogs here in the United States with an average price of $1.22. Obviously, averages can be extremely misleading. Tadpoles, we've got listed 19 farms that reported to the last census of ag. And then you're looking at about $119,000 in sales, or 50 and 54 cents per pound. The US also breaks these two out by state, so who's actually producing what, but you'll notice a lot of D's, Z's, and X's, which pretty much means they didn't either have the data or there was not enough data that they could not actually show these numbers because there were so few farms. It would just be singling out a single farm, and that is not what USDA is attempting to do. But here in the Midwest, we do see for frogs, Michigan and Wisconsin showing up. And then for tadpoles, we have quite a few states showing up again here in the Midwest: Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio. And then, of course, not technically here in the Midwest, but just our East Pennsylvania listing 5 farms here. So there are quite a few farms that actually show up, and it gives you a little bit of value here. But I think the most important part is no one in Ohio really would have paid attention to the Census of Ag or the Census of Aquaculture regarding frogs and tadpoles, but we have changes in regulations, and now we want to see what's out there. So we really need to make sure that I hope that you all are participating in the census, because it means a lot for myself, for the OAA, for the National Aquaculture Association. The data are what the data are, and these data show 9 frog farms and 19 tadpole farms. There could be 2 or 3 times that, but we have to present obviously what's there and listed by USDA. So first things first, I do want to mention we don't have to worry anything about these species. The 2 species that were approved that Mr. Kayle is going to talk about later are the American bullfrog and the green frog. This is pulled up from USGS, completely native to the area, so we don't have to worry about culturing an animal that is not already native to our area. So you can see that kind of orangish goldish look there, being a native range for your American bullfrog. And then while slightly restricted, you still see it completely really covers almost all of for the green frog as well, and a lot of the same areas. So these are native species that we're talking about here. We're not talking about importing or culturing anything that's not already here and that started out here and that has been transported for throughout the state, within the state, for a very long time. And then I would encourage you, if you are starting to get into this or you just need to know more, Mr. Kayle may talk about this later, but there is an Amphibians of Ohio field guide. The bullfrogs and green frogs are pretty easy to distinguish from a lot of other frogs, but they do have that plate, which helps them stand out a little bit. But I think it's a really good document for you to peruse and look to make sure you understand some of your differences in amphibians and knowing obviously what can and cannot be cultured, what can be moved, and things of that nature. So very quickly, you do have the American bullfrog, which there's a little bit of language that accompanies that, as well as the northern green frog there. And so I'm not going to hit on the next 2 slides terribly hard, but we need to, of course, understand, and as we talked about already, these animals are something that most of us have dealt with since our school days, but they're cold-blooded, so their body temperatures, similar to the fish, are going to be regulated by the environment. So when it's cold, metabolism slows down, they're not going to eat as much, they're not going to move as much, and then obviously that kind of ramps up in the summertime, which is why we feed our fish much more heavily during the summertime, because it's warm, their metabolism's high, they're wanting to eat a lot more. And so here's just obviously a couple bullet points and obviously kind of the culturing of the animals. But these animals, 25, 40,000 eggs, depending on the size of the animal. They're gonna hatch, even up here in the Midwest, in Ohio, for the most part, they're gonna hatch in less than a week. But all of that, again, is gonna depend on water temperature. Same thing with our fish as well, how fast those eggs hatch and how fast they hatch and break through is gonna depend on temperature. Not just temperature, but largely temperature. So understand, obviously, tadpoles are going to graze on plants and algae, but they are omnivores. And then tadpoles are going to metamorphosis into frogs, obviously, at the end. We all know what this graph looks like. I saw Dr. Roy's presentation beforehand, so I knew he was going to show this slide. So I have the same slide up here, or at least the same picture. But we obviously need to understand, if we're trying to culture the animals on purpose, how those diets shift of the animals over time, because we understand that the tail is going to absorb into the body and then the legs are going to descend. Well, with that tail, there's quite a bit of nutrients there. And so those nutrients are going to be absorbed by that frog, but they also need to be fed as well. And I'll get into a couple slides here in just a couple minutes, talking about the diet and feeding these animals if we're trying to culture them on purpose. So the Amphibians of Ohio guide doesn't show them growing quite this big, but we know in some regions of the world, the same species, the American bullfrog, can get up to 8 inches and even over 1.5 pounds. We're not going to be growing them that high. Green frog, obviously quite a bit smaller. But of course, we need to consider that we're just really going to be culturing these almost exclusively to a tadpole stage. It's going to be cheaper, it's going to be faster, it can be obviously a lot easier and less expensive to do. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about actually culturing the animals and what's shown up in some Southern Regional Aquaculture Center documents, as well as some FAO documents. But of course, we need to make sure that whatever I discuss here, whatever Mr. Kevin Kayle talks about here in a little while, if you do decide to proceed, we need to make sure that we are following all of the rules and regs that accompanies this, because the rule did change January 1st. And so this is all brand new to all of us. So we, of course, just want to do all of this in the correct way. So for those of you who didn't know, the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center is one of the USDA NEFA funded centers, regional aquaculture centers, they call them RACs, that has quite a few extension publications that are very useful. And of course, everyone has heard of the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center. It's just our southern counterpart. But they list here for all life stages, the most important day-to-day management consideration is adequate sanitation to prevent bacterial disease. And I pull this from the document, the SRAC 0436, is particular on culturing bullfrogs. And there are a lot of pictures in that Southern Region document that talks about artificial ponds, which I'll show you a picture of from Asia here in just a second. But it talks about things very different than obviously what we can control and what we can control in our normal aquaculture production ponds here in the Midwest. Obviously, there's not really a lot of sanitation we can do in these types of systems, but what we obviously have to do is take into consideration what language is out there and how can we amend that, and at least take that into consideration as we culture the animals ourselves here. So we may not be able to obviously disinfect a pond, but we can certainly disinfect a net if it goes from one farm to another, or a dip net, making sure it gets dipped on in something like bleach or Burcon or another product. The same document soon afterwards says sanitary and nutritionally complete diet also must be provided for each phase of the life cycle. So for the most part, and as Luke mentioned, the folks in Arkansas produce more tadpoles on accident than probably every other state does on purpose combined. But it never fails that when we try to culture these animals, we might end up not being able to culture anything. And we heard earlier from Dr. Dave talking about once fish-eating birds or amphibian-eating birds find out, you have really trouble there. But it says sanitation and nutritionally complete feed must also be provided for each phase of the life cycle. So as we're thinking about these tadpoles being omnivorous, but largely eating on algae and plankton, we also need to take into consideration that while we want to have a heavy plankton bloom for these animals to eat and to clean up, if we don't have quite a great bloom there, we do need to obviously take into consideration having food there so that they can actually eat, because that's the last thing we need is for any of these animals to starve or die off if we're trying to sell them to a pond and lake management company for them to, of course, then turn around and sell. And even if these animals aren't directly consuming the feed that is provided, this nutritionally complete diet, what is a diet if it's not eaten? If anything else, obviously it's just going to break down, and what we're going to get out of that is a little bit more algae bloom, because those nutrients are going to be leached into that pond, and obviously plants are going to uptake it, and we'll see a growth in algae in plants, which is kind of a secondary benefit, obviously, for these tadpoles. And we see the same thing being done in Arkansas with some of the bait fish operations. The bait may not consume all of the feed directly, but that expensive feed does turn into a little bit of a fertilizer. So not specific to the United States, the Southern Region document that I talked about, as well as some of the other documents, talked about a 1:5 female to adult ratio in open pens, which I have somewhat of an open pen. It is artificial, but listed later as brooders. If they are going to be retained in these pens, then you need to create a space above the water or islands with a shade cloth over part of the culture. So this is obviously for your brood stock. Having an area where your tadpoles can come out of the water and sort of an island is extremely beneficial. Again, not specific to the United States. It talks a little bit here, and this document is, or this presentation is recorded, so you don't have to memorize everything, but it does talk about how much live feed is needed to be able to give those brooders enough energy, as well as what size pen you actually need. And so because there's not a ton of information out there, I did obviously look up what some of these other, what some of these individual small scale, extremely small scale farmers were doing, and things like YouTube, and spent quite a lot of time diving through some of these documents to try to see what matches up with the scientific literature. And one of these obviously was what was mentioned in the Southern Regional document was kind of a quote unquote pen or artificial pond, and then you have an island, and it's a little tough to see, but on the left and the right side, that is concrete that's been lifted up, and they have a little area for the frogs to be able to hide into, and then there is a shade cloth above. Obviously, this is all man-made and prepared, which is very different than what we were obviously going to do here in the United States. However, again, we just need to learn from what these other folks are doing and adopt that to what we can here in the United States. So once the eggs have actually been laid in this area, oftentimes they're taken to a hatchery or even somewhere else to hatch. If you do take them into a hatchery, you do need to have sunlight, which a lot of folks are trying to get rid of, obviously, any algal growth on the sides of their tank walls because they want to be able to maintain water quality. But if you are going to try to hatch these folks inside, you need to be able to have that sunlight so that you can get some algae growth. Feed's always needed. If they are to be hatched inside, about 21 days, you can take them out to the culture ponds. They do recommend extremely shallow pond depth for these tadpoles. And I think for us to consider, I didn't really think about the size of these tadpoles being stocked, but obviously it's the same thing with hybrid striped bass and some other species. You really do, because of their size, you really do need to be able to drain and refill that pond, no matter if it's, again, what you have a recommended depth here or what we are stocking in one of our normal ponds that might be 6 to 8 feet, depending on the size or deeper. You need to take into consideration aquatic insects really hammering these tadpoles if we are not, the very small tadpoles that have just been stocked, if we're not careful. They do talk about recommended stocking rate, about 75 to 100 per cubic yard, feeding a prepared diet, having a large plankton bloom, and then of course, as frogs do go through that transition, to be able to have some way to separate them, because we know that frogs are carnivores, so they're going to eat everything they can. So obviously in Ohio, we're most likely just going to use a pond that's not being utilized. They may allow frogs to lay their eggs and remove the frogs with a net or a grater, which is obviously not going to be very easy. Obviously, if you don't remove these adults, we need to take into consideration a lot of tadpoles getting eaten. And I think one of the things we really have to take into consideration here is the buyers here in Ohio. They really can't sit back and allow boom and bust to happen. They need a consistent supply of quite a few tadpoles that I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about the demand in a little while. But what we can't have is for everything to just be free falling and we just let everything happen naturally and hope for the best, because we either end up with no tadpoles or we end up with a ton of tadpoles and we've got nothing to do with them. So some sort of ability to control production, and at least given a little bit of forethought as far as how we want to produce these animals, other than just saying, I hope it works out, is going to be necessary. It is really likely to be most beneficial to fill these right before the breeding season and then fertilize these ponds, because again, we talked about the aquatic insects really dominating these tadpoles, which I never really, again, thought about, even though it's very common with something like hybrid striped bass to fill these ponds and then fertilize very quickly or very soon before you actually stock those animals. Oops. So in Ohio, I think Matt Brim's going to talk about this here later on, but one of their, this is a picture of their operation and what they've got going on now. Most of you have heard of the split pond system. This is something they currently have going on at their own farm. So these are 3 ponds, and the way this pond works is water is lifted by submersible pumps up into this top pond right here where you can see the yellow perch that I've put in. After that, everything else is gravity fed, but water is lifted up through here and then meanders through the fish and then goes out on this side. Water then, without fish, this area does not have any fish in it. All you have is a lot of plankton, and basically what you have are large filters that are going through and cleaning the water up. And the water falls down through here. Again, it's just another biofilter continually cleaning up the water here before this transition lifts. So what we essentially have here is a little bit of a recirculation system. You've got your fish tank here and you've got all your fish filters over here. Obviously something that the Brims may consider, not telling them to for sure, but one thing we can consider is utilizing one of these ponds as a small area to culture some tadpoles. Whether you add in small nets here, which might be beneficial, little culture nets on each side of, say, if you have 4 of these in here. But as they are largely, they're omnivores, but they eat a lot of plankton and algae. What you have here is a great amount of nutrients being provided by the yellow perch because you're feeding them a lot. They're excreting a lot of waste. Those nutrients then, obviously, some of them can be uptaken by the plants, by the plants, but also by the algae that we have here as well. The tadpoles that are here. One possible scenario, as they talked about having 2 feet of approximately 2 feet being very beneficial for some tadpoles. That was only if you have flowing water through there, because as I'll talk very briefly, a lot of the same water quality parameters are necessary for tadpoles as they are for fish. So if you did want to do something where it was extremely shallow, is what was recommended by the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center, you would need fresh water to be able to be introduced. So obviously something that is possible is to divert that water that goes from the yellow perch pond, have some of it dip down into the second biofilter pond, and some of it go to the primary pond to help you be able to, 1, bring flowing water through there, but 2, not make it so that you have to have that water completely topped off at that 5 to 7 feet or so. Can compromise a little bit on both scenarios. Obviously, these pictures are familiar to a lot of folks, but you could also potentially do these in holding tanks. So when looking at some of these videos of some of the Asian countries and how they were culturing the animals, it really wasn't too different than what we would see here. Obviously, these are a few feet deep, but you could control that water temperature very easily. You can provide shade. You can provide that fresh water. You can very easily remove adults if you're worried about adults eating tadpoles. You can obviously provide some live feed. We did hear earlier when Luke was talking about a detriment to what adult bullfrogs do is how many minnows that they actually consume. We do need to take that obviously into consideration because it does get extremely expensive. But you can provide some minnows. You could fill the water from a pond, so as opposed to just having it straight well water. So there are potential a lot of benefits with something like this. And this obviously provides you a lot more control and could just be as you start to learn and do some trial run work with it, what that could look like. I'll just skim on this because this is old information and we have seen some new stuff here. Actually, the stuff on the right's old information. The stuff on the left's pretty new. there have been some specially formulated diets produced, not a lot of that being here in the United States, again, because there's no real commercial culture of them. But tadpoles have been reared on commercial salmon starter diets. For those of you who like to think alternatively, folks have done well with duckweed, pawpaw leaves, and even commercial finfish diet combinations. For sure, we need to consider that their diets change over time. And we, of course, need to consider that tadpoles are a bit omnivorous, but frogs, as we know, like their food really to be moving. And then the stuff on the right all comes from, again, that bullfrog culture. This is, again, from 1999, so it's an old document, but a lot of the information still remains the same. And so there's some diet formulations that they do provide here, but it is a really good document for people to peruse. So water quality, I already mentioned a lot of the same parameters that we need to take and consider for our warmer, cooler water species applies to these animals as well. Again, they are cold-blooded animals. For markets, I think we're largely going to be thinking about pond stocking companies here in Ohio. So ask some of the farmers who are engaged in this, who might be purchasing, ask them about what that market looks like. If you're going to try to consider these animals for food, which again, more power to you, and feel free to contact me, but we of course need to understand that you still have to go through the FDA seafood HACCP, that's the hazard analysis and critical control points. Those regulations still apply for you. And I'm sorry, I did cut off a little bit here, but Dr. Greg Lutz created a document just the other day. It was published in late December where I pulled that picture from, but I'll reference that here in a little bit. But if you are wanting to do it for food, luckily it's still showing here. He does talk about 50% of the carcass being edible, which is really good. And then I just found a couple of documents here when we're thinking about markets and what people can buy. Obviously, everyone's going to buy and sell, and some of this is wholesale, some of this is retail. And then heaven forbid you look to purchase tadpoles for a science experiment as part of a school operation, because they get probably 10 or 15 times as expensive as what we're seeing here. Just a couple little websites I was able to pull out here. So it can give you a little idea of what a couple of the markets have looked like and what they're selling the animals for. I will say for the resources here, so I'm finishing up. I know I've got just a few minutes. First and foremost, contact me and we'll make sure to work with ODW to make sure whatever we're proposing, however we're proposing to get these animals onto a farm, or if they're already on the farm, what we can do with them, where they can be sold, and things of that nature. A lot of that's going to be discussed here in a little bit, but still it's something that we need to take into consideration first and foremost. And then as far as the resources that I provided here, I knew Dr. Roy was going to talk about his control of bullfrogs and their tadpoles, and so I didn't provide that up here. But there is a new document, again, in the bottom left by Dr. Lutz, talking about why frog farming is set for success. That's through the fish site. And of course, that's an international site, and that's obviously he wasn't directing that to the United States. There are some other really old documents from the Virginia Cooperative Extension talking about commercial frog farming. Basically, I think that was in the 90s as well. Again, saying there's some interest there, but it's just too hard to either A, compete with wild caught, or two, compete with what foreign countries are able to do. And then lastly, there is a little bit of information that folks should definitely take the time to look at through the FAO, so the Food and Ag Organization of the United States. And then with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will answer any questions if we have them. Thank you. All right. No, I don't see any questions.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, sir.
Matt Bram here. When you say the tadpoles are omnivorous, are they eating plankton? Are they eating bacterial films, or what do you mean by omnivorous besides plants? What kind of animal component is that they're eating?
So again, from what I can tell and from what I've seen, from the omnivorous standpoint, they're going to eat pretty much just about anything they can really get in their mouths. And again, what we consider the tadpole or the larval stage, anytime from when they are first hatch all the way up until their legs have fully descended and their tails have fully absorbed. And so I really think obviously their mouths are going to get different, and they're going to slightly select and become more carnivorous as they kind of approach that full frog. Sorry, it kicked me out. I knew
Yeah.
it's been exactly 60 minutes, and so I guess it kicked me out. I'm sorry about that. So Matt, I think I just ended it up with, I really do think as omnivores, whatever they can, I think their preference really is a large algal bloom, so that they can eat really anything they can put in their mouths. But that gets back to even from the time they first hatched, that's where they talk about in the hatchery, providing sunlight so that they can eat bacterial films, so that they can eat the algae, so that they can eat the microscopic plants that they can consume.
Sounds like when they get a little bit older that they turn the tables on the dragonfly larvae and things like that were probably preying on them when they were very small. I got one other question along that line, and I can't remember when tadpoles become air breathers. Can anybody give me a approximation on that? Because that obviously has things to do with the water quality, the oxygen requirements, that change as that happens.
Yeah, I looked at that little, there's some obviously diagrams at when lungs are created and when they're not. So I can't remember exactly when, and I do think it's largely going to depend on, as you talked about, the water temperature. But I don't want to say something that I don't know. I'll just say I don't remember exactly at what point that happens. But we, of course, as you stand out into those ponds, you just see bloop, bloop, bloop as they are, coming up for a breath. And I don't know exactly at what point that kind of transitions over to where they are fully air breathers.
Right.
So I'll say I can look it up for you, but I don't want to lie and say something that I don't have.
This one.
Okay, we are at 11:01. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn off my screen, and then I will pass it over to Mr. Kevin Kayle so that he can give his Ohio Division of Wildlife presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Matt. Good morning, everybody. We start by sharing my screen. We'll go to, hopefully, the presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see the PowerPoint.
Yes, we can. It is not in full screen, but we see you and we see your PowerPoint. And again, I will turn my video on when there's about 4 or 5 minutes left in your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Okay, today I'm going to give a Division of Wildlife update on specialty permits. The Division of Wildlife has that authority, but also to spend a little time talking about the new regulation for frogs and tadpoles. So today's permit program update for the Division of Wildlife, we have the authority within the state to sell and allow aquatic specialty permits. These are the permits you guys are most familiar with that include aquaculture A and B. Those two different classes depend on what species you're raising. Generally, if they're native fish species or fish that are commonly found in the state of Ohio in the watershed that you're in, those will be classed as aquaculture A. If they're from outside the watershed or species of interest or concern or possibly invasive, they get classified as aquaculture B. And that's in Ohio Administrative Code. We also have a whole host of other specialty permits that we sell and have authority over, things like bait collectors and dealers, fish transportation, fish wholesale, triploid grass carp permits, and then particularly for the frogs and tadpoles, they had typically fallen as amphibians under the wildlife propagator permits. We have established an online renewal process, or actually an online application process. If you're renewing your aquatic specialty permit and you go to our website, it'll direct you to our vendor who sells these permits. And if you have no changes from the previous year, it's essentially a one-stop shop. You can go through the application, click on renew, make your payment, and as part of the last process, you are sent a copy of your permit for the year. If there are changes, then there's sort of a one stop where we look at the permit, review the permit, and decide if we have to do inspections, then we'll arrange an inspection. If we don't, then we move on the process. We did have a web address change this year. That's our new web address. The website crashed because of ransomware sometime during the late spring, early summer. And we had to essentially build a website from the ground up. So if you go to the new website, across the top, there are a number of tabs, and you will go through business and industry tab and go down to that. You'll see business activities, and then the aquaculture, bait, and the other aquatic specialty permits are listed under that. So take a look at that website. If you've got any questions, certainly you can either ask them online, or you can get a hold of us and we'll walk you through the process for either renewing or getting a specialty permit online. One of the other things is with the coronavirus, some folks typically would go through the mail-in process of printing out an application or going into a district office to get their permits. With COVID-19 regulations and guidance still in effect, a lot of our offices are short-staffed and their hours are reduced. So check with the office that you typically go into before you show up. And certainly if you're mailing your permit in, expect that there may be another week to 10 days to get that thing reviewed and approved, and then processed and get the permit back to you through the regular mail. Overall, there really weren't any wholesale changes to the process or to the fees for the season 2021. The permits run calendar year from January to December. So if you haven't re-upped yet, now's the time to do it. And if you're interested in the new permit or change to permit, now's also a good time to do that as well. And then you'll have the rest of the year for this permit. One of the other things we're looking at on the regular fishing and hunting license side of things, we have a new app. It's Hunt Fish Ohio, and you can actually get resources and buy your licenses and keep copies of your licenses on your phone through a mobile app. And one of the things we're looking at is, do we develop something like this for our specialty permits as well? We're not there yet. We're just starting to roll out the regular licenses, but just like we brought regular license sales online, maybe at some point in time in the near future, next couple of years, we could be looking at developing a mobile app process for the specialty permits as well. So the important permit program updates for 2021, there are really two that I want to highlight. First of all, in 2020, we went through the review process and we added 2 species to the injurious aquatic invasive species list. That means that marbled crayfish, which are also known as marmot crabs, and the New Zealand mud snail When they were added to Ohio's injurious and aquatic invasive species list, that means that they are illegal to possess for culture and sales, and there's no sales, no imports, or no exports. We really don't want these bad players in Ohio, primarily because they would be a threat to native species and really are quite invasive. So that was the big change there for our injurious species. But the other big one, the one I'm going to spend most time today on, is we had a review process during 2020 to add native green frog and bullfrog tadpoles in adults, to classify them as aquaculture A species. And for that reason, they would be allowed for sale by aquaculture permit holders in the state of Ohio beginning January 1 of 2021 on their aquaculture permits. So let's review for the frog and tadpole sales in Ohio that are just starting. First of all, we knew for a long time that stakeholders were interested in having the ability to sell frogs and tadpoles off their aquaculture facilities. In the past, one of the things that happened was you couldn't sell them, and aquaculture operations were literally having to bury tadpoles, juvenile frogs, and sort them out and get them, spend a lot of time and effort, like we heard in earlier presentations. That's additional effort in the culture process. And folks told us that this was a resource that they would be able to sell, that there was a demand out there for these frogs and tadpoles. So we listened to that, and prior to this expansion and the change in OAC, the only way that an operation could sell frogs and tadpoles was through a wildlife propagator's permit because they were classified as amphibians. And the primary focus of this effort was the sale of adult frogs for food. We knew that there were some sales too for educational purposes or scientific purposes, but really the main focus of this effort under the propagator's permit was for food. And it really was very small scale, and we typically didn't see a lot of aquaculture facilities picking up this additional permit to do that. So during the process in 2019, there was an effort to try and put it into a budget bill and change ORC. And we really heard from our director and from other folks that we needed to have the ability to be able to address this under OAC. So we held meetings with stakeholders to try and get their desires and opinions, and to find out a way that we could do this, not only to meet the aquaculture interests, but we also had to address the interests of the herps communities who were concerned about frogs becoming a vector of disease across the state, and possibly having threatened and endangered species being impacted by, just the release of frogs and tadpoles across the state of Ohio through aquaculture permits or through the secondary sales and expansion and release of these animals. So we held meetings to address everybody's desires and opinions, to hear them out. And then we crafted language in administrative code and proposed to define native Ohio bullfrogs and green frog tadpoles in adults as Class A aquaculture species. So these are our typical native species. It's not going to require additional inspections through the process. They would be treated just like essentially bass and bluegills and perch and other Class A species across the state of Ohio. So we went through this hearing and review process. It's called the 119 process, where we proposed this to our Wildlife Council, and then the Wildlife Council reviews it, discusses it, and they approved it this past fall in 2020. And then after their approval and the Chief of Division of Wildlife's approval, It goes on to the review and approval process by the Joint Committee of Agency Rule Review, which is composed of a select number of Ohio House and Senate representatives, and they approved it. And then once that's approved, it goes on for governor's signature, and the governor approved it in December of 2020. So it became part of aquaculture class A species and part of the aquaculture permit process just in time for 2021. So what the new language does do, it allows for the sales of native Ohio bullfrogs and green frog tadpoles and adults that are on aquaculture facility grounds and in production areas. It does not allow aquaculture operations to go out and harvest frogs and tadpoles in the wild. One of the things that the other stakeholder groups were concerned about was folks going to a public waters and harvesting a bunch of frogs and tadpoles and then bringing them onto their facilities and culturing them and then turning around and selling them. So that the new language does not allow that, but it does allow for those frogs and tadpoles on aquaculture facilities to be sold with the aquaculture permit. We also wanted to maintain the wildlife propagator permit that's still out there for amphibians and the rest of the frogs, even green frogs and bullfrogs are still classified under that site as well. So that if folks do have a propagator's permit, they're not forced to go out and buy an aquaculture permit. They can still hold their propagator permit and do their culture of frogs and amphibians just like they had done in the past. And that includes importing frogs and tadpoles from out of state and allowing their culture there. One of the other things it does, it maintains reporting, typically like we have for other aquaculture species. So if you are culturing and selling bullfrogs and green frogs, you're going to be part of that reporting and inspection process as well, just like you are with other aquaculture species. If you're transporting them off-site for sales or transport to other customers, and you have an fish transportation permit, which is part of the aquaculture permit series, you're allowed to transport them. So you won't have to go out and purchase a different fish transport permit or any other kind of animal transportation permit. We have that covered under the gratis portion. If you look at your aquaculture permit process in the application, there's a checkbox there that you can check off to get a free fish transport permit, and they're covered under that. What the new language does not do, it does not allow for direct sales or culture of out-of-state frogs and tadpoles under the aquaculture permit. So again, it's native Ohio frogs and tadpoles that you find on your grounds or have track record of from, I know if we've got a big operation like Jones or Freshwater Farms and they want to purchase frogs and tadpoles from another Ohio culture operation, if you have that track record and have that culture permit record keeping, then you would be allowed to do that. But it's the out-of-state frogs and tadpoles that do not fall under the Class A aquaculture permits. It also does not allow the importation, possession, and culture of out-of-state bullfrogs and green frogs under the aquaculture permits. And that includes without written prior authorization from the chief of the Division of Wildlife. And that's part of the OAC that was just promulgated here within this last year. It also does not allow a customer or permittee to directly release cultured frogs and tadpoles into public waters of the state of Ohio or into any waters without the landowner's approval. So one of the things that our stakeholders, and certainly we as managers of the resources of the state of Ohio, we're concerned about is the release of bullfrogs or adult frogs into say, reservoirs in the state, or even privately managed lakes or other water bodies without that landowner's approval. So clubs can't stock these animals surreptitiously. The other thing that this language does not do, that I don't have a bullet on here, is it does not allow operations to sell to bait dealers. Frogs and tadpoles are not listed as bait in the state of Ohio. So tadpoles cannot be sold by bait, and we will not have bait dealers buying bait permits and trying to sell frogs and tadpoles here in the state. So with that, just a couple slides there to end my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions or comments now, and certainly we can hold them over to later with the Q&A at the end.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I don't see any open questions at this time, but I know we're going to have a few. I'll give it a second for people to think. And go ahead, Dave. I see you unmuted.
Yeah, of course, I guess the big question is that I didn't realize before. I'm hearing that if you have the wildlife propagators permit, we can't import our out-of-state sources like we've been doing for the last 8 years and be able to sell those retail for stocking.
Now, that's the trick, Dave. Were you selling them in the past for stocking? Because in the past, they could only be sold on the wildlife propagator side for food. So that's
Food for human food?
human food, yeah.
Well, I guess I wish it was a little more clear, obviously. I wish it was truly a Class A species, because we have no other restrictions on any other Class A species for source.
Right.
We don't care if the bluegill, the bass come from Arkansas or wherever. So unfortunately, we don't have that clarity. And I understand the concerns about the other input, people that were inputting to this process. But as it often happens, a lot of those people don't understand what aquaculture does, what they need. I mean, we heard these concerns in the 90s when, oh, you can't raise perch because they're going to be catching perch from Lake Erie and whatever. You know, it's like people that thought when we started that, well, where in the Mad River do you get all your trout that you're selling? No, you know, it's, even if it's not economically feasible. And it's the same way with trying to go out in the wild to capture tadpoles. Oh my gosh, we don't have to go there. It's the farms where they're throwing away 5-gallon buckets full of tadpoles because they can't do anything with it. They've sorted them out of their minnow operations or goldfish operations, whatever. And here they are being wasted, and we can't even introduce what is a native species, as Matt pointed out, over virtually the whole country, on at least the 2/3 of the country. So I guess I'm hoping that maybe we can still move toward that in some way, because I don't see how there are enough tadpoles for me to buy, just for our operation from the places that we have in Ohio. I talked to Bill before we started. He doesn't have it, you know.
Right. I heard that conversation. And
so
I think
here we are.
You're right, Dave. And I think one of the things that we wanted to try to do was to, one, allow this initial regulation to open the door to allow the sales for aquaculture operations. And I think as we see that demand is going unmet from, say, larger operations, then eventually what we'll have is most likely a change in the process where we can look for expansion. But I think we want, the first trick was to get this door opened and to allow the sales in state. The second thing is if you look at the second to the last slide in there, if you look at the OAC, that there's going to be some point in time where I would expect that we would have operations proposed to the chief under that item I in 3101 of being able to import and then allow culture of those imported individuals and sales of those individuals. So
Yeah, I did notice that. And I appreciate obviously the first step. I mean, it's taken us a while to get there,
Right.
but this is a good thing for that.
And I think if once we get this sort of the first round and sort of feel out demand, see how the whole permit process is going, then we can look at expansion, say within a year or two, and moving that out and then setting up the process there, just like we have with wildlife propagation, just like we have with importing bait fish and sport fish, those kind of things. So yeah,
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah.
yep. No, we're fully aware of it. We want to see this whole process as it unfolds. So we don't want to rush out there, overexpose ourselves, run into problems, and then have to pull back, because that would be much more difficult. So
Yeah, Kevin, that's a primary thing for me, is seeing that this is a Class A and not treated as a normal Class A. And so I think OSU Extension and Division of Wildlife, whether it's something I just author and you guys review or what, but I think we need some sort of flow chart. You know, did the animals come from here? Did they come from here? And say this, here's what you can do, because you've got a Class A species, not a typical Class A species. You've got this wildlife propagator's permit here. This is what you can do. Selling for food. You can stock into these private waterways if you have the landowner's permission, and it's just not super clear. For those of you who don't know, I did write up a very extensive fact sheet on all of the aquaculture permits with review of Division of Wildlife, as well as OSU Extension lawyers, to try to get them to review. But all of that was finalized before all of this frog stuff actually came to fruition. So we're gonna have to go back and relook at that. And that's probably where this flow chart will probably end up, so that we have a more holistic document.
right, and for us to get this permit process through all the review and go through the JCAR, the 119 process, JCAR and governor sign off in time for permit year for calendar 2021, this was the best way to do it. We would have to reclassify frogs and tadpoles as something different than Class A, or Class B, which is going to require inspection before the permit's even allowed. Then we would have to go through the ORC process. And to do that, you would have to introduce a bill, have it go through the House and Senate committees, and then the open floor of the House and Senate, and then get that approved under, you know, the governor's signature. And that wasn't going to happen before the calendar year 2021 permit season. So like I said with Dr. Dave, this was sort of the way to get it out there to see how we start the process in 2021, and then we can move from there.
All right, thanks so much. We're definitely behind, but we knew we would, because Kevin's going to get asked a lot of questions. We do still have a panel discussion after this. Next, we'll again ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute themselves, and we'll have Adam Hayter with Jones Fish Hatchery give an update on how to haul these animals. And Adam, you should have capability, and I will flex your time a little bit and come on when you've got a few minutes.
All right, can we see that, Matt?
Yes, but we do see your next slide. Just a second ago, you had it to where we could only see your presentation. Yep, display settings. Yep, there you go.
Better? All right, great. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit today about the harvest and post-hauling care of tadpoles, both American bullfrog and, of course, green frog here. Matt mentioned my name's Adam Hayter with Jones Fish Hatcheries. We're out of Cincinnati, Ohio. Our farm here has 20 production ponds, and if you are ever in the Cincinnati area, I encourage you to swing by. We have regular hours, open to the public, and kind of a cool place. So swing by if you're ever in the area. Starting today, want to, offer a thanks to both the Ohio Aquaculture Association and the Ohio Division of Wildlife. This regulation change occurred amidst the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know we spent many of hours on Zoom calls and Zoom meetings discussing changes and going back and forth with the Division of Wildlife. And I appreciate the efforts here, both from the OAA and ODW on that. Well, we really can't talk about hauling until we first discuss maybe some post-harvest holding strategies. And you'll find that through much of this discussion, there's lots of similarities with holding and hauling tadpoles, lots of similarities with those animals and, say, holding and hauling live fish. And when you have a post-harvest group of animals here, typically those need to be confined or penned, and often that's done pond side in a net cage or a net pen, or in some type of holding tank, whether that be indoor or outdoor. And regardless of what holding vessel you're using, you want to make sure that those animals are properly aerated, just like you would with a fish population. The one thing with tadpoles, Dr. Dave, I don't have the answer either as to when do they start breathing air, but I will tell you that tadpoles of really any size do exhibit piping behavior, and that's where animals will rush to the surface, take a gulp of air, and then jet back down below water. And when you have animals confined in holding tanks or pens, cages, those animals do need to come up to the surface and take that breath of air there. This is important to mention because there has been some discussion today about the risk of predators being birds, raccoons, unruly neighborhood children, and the like. And, the easiest way to avoid predation from birds and so forth is to cover your cages, your pens, or your tanks. And that'll protect you from predators, but it can, of course, limit or prohibit that piping behavior. So you want to make sure that if you do cover your pens, cages, tanks with a net or something like that, you need to still have that void, that top space where piping behavior can occur. Also important to note here is when tadpoles are first harvested, there is a tremendous excretion of mud. It is vital for the health of these organisms to make sure that you're purging that group of animals with lots and lots of fresh water. The mud purge here cannot be understated. It is substantial. All right, so we're going to start hauling these animals. Couple of tips here on loading into the live haul tanks. And again, lots of similarities here with hauling live fish. But because of the mud purge that I just talked about, it's going to be important to pick and sort any contaminants in the population of tadpoles. We commonly see, sunfish or crayfish, goldfish being, hitchhikers in a population of tadpoles. And because of this mud excretion that's going to occur over hours while in a holding tank or hauling tank, a lot of these contaminants just will not be able to tolerate that deteriorating water quality. So it's something that we see a high mortality on. And if you have morts in the hauling water, that again is going to add to this deteriorating water quality issue. So pick your morts and then pick your contaminants just to maintain good water quality in the hauling tank. We're hauling tadpoles roughly 2 pounds per gallon of water in the hauling tank. We always try and use the cleanest water available. A lot of times if you're loading from a temporary holding tank, we'll opt not to use that water just because it's generally dirty from the mud purge. As I mentioned, lots of similarities here with hauling fish and of course, clean water. I prefer spring water or well water opposed to pond water, but a lot of times if you're loading pond side, that might not be an option. But emphasis on as clean a water as possible here. I prefer to haul tadpoles in water temperatures that range from mid 50s to mid 60s. There's nothing wrong with hauling animals at a higher temperature than that. But you know, the warmer the water is in your hauling tank, typically the fewer animals you'll be able to haul. We do use ice as needed, but just like with a fish population, it's important to not shock the animals by over icing. I find in our hauling tanks, which are 50 to 55 gallons on average, I find that a 10-pound bag of ice is going to lower your hauling water approximately 3 degrees. And 3 degrees is a nice, easy fluctuation that's going to not shock the animals there. Again, just like with a fish population, when you're hauling tadpoles, you want to make sure there's adequate dissolved oxygen available for those animals, especially during the first hour. During the loading process, you know, these animals are going from a temporary holding tank into a bucket, then ultimately into the hauling tank. That transition, that moving, certainly gets those animals excited, and that's typically when you see the highest demand for oxygen in the water. And then lastly here is the clogging of the air diffusers. Doesn't really matter what type of diffuser you're using, whether this is a BioWeave or a soaker hose or even a 0.4, because of the mud excretion from the tadpoles, diffusers in tadpole hauling tanks are really susceptible to fouling and clogging. So please keep an eye and be aware that these diffusers will clog. And if you're on a long haul with tadpoles, that's something you definitely want to keep a close eye on. Now, Dr. Roy mentioned the tolerance that tadpoles and bullfrogs have for salt, which is true. And as you know, when we're hauling live fish, we typically do use salt as a general tonic, and it does help calm the fish down. But in the case of tadpoles, this is where I would encourage you not to use any salt in the hauling water. Not that it's going to harm the animals, but the salt does have a tendency to amplify this mud excretion, this mud purge here. Something else, just like I mentioned with the holding tanks post-harvest, when you're hauling tadpoles, you definitely want to allow for top space because these animals will continue to pipe right on through the transportation process there. In our tanks, rather than filling them all the way up to the top like we would for a population of fish, we'll leave 3-4 inches of top space so the piping behavior can continue there. All right, so post-hauling, you know, after you've hauled these animals from the pond back to a holding shed and you've unloaded these animals, I would highly encourage you to not waste any time and clean the interior of your hauling tanks. There is often a mud deposit that is quite substantial. Everything is coated. And this goes along same lines here for your diffusers. And again, it doesn't matter what diffuser you're using, but again, if you've hauled tadpoles in a hauling tank, typically your diffusers are going to have some type of reduction in efficacy because of the amount of mud that's excreted from those animals there. Post-hauling care, you know, once the animals have completed the hauling process and they're now tanked for further distribution or sale, you would absolutely want to expect a further mud purge. I would encourage you to flush the tanks generously multiple times per day or continuously if possible. This excretion of mud is going to last at least a few more days, and it is something that you want to try and get out of the water just to maintain good water quality there and adequate sanitation. So As it comes to housing densities, post-haul, we use dissolved oxygen in all of our tanks, and we're able to successfully hold tadpoles at a rate of 100 pounds of tadpoles to about 300, 350 gallons of water. With traditional diffusers, gassed blowers, you're going to see a reduction in that quantity of livestock there, 75 to 100 pounds of livestock per 300, 350 gallons of water there. Additional post-hauling care items of note here is, again, I can't emphasize this enough. The diffusers, not only in your hauling tanks, but also in your holding tanks post-haul, they will continue to foul from mud excretion. They're going to routinely need to be scrubbed. And then, of course, just to maintain good water quality and adequate sanitation, make sure you're picking any mortalities. Again, continue to flush, anticipate that mud purge. And, while in a holding tank, we always try and keep them nice and cool and avoid any direct exposure to sunlight there. And then lastly here is, if you're hauling any late stage tadpoles where they're starting to develop legs and arms, often those animals are going to want some type of structure to cling to, or even to pull themselves up onto so they can rest. So with that, that's all I have. And Matt, if I have a minute, I'll definitely take some questions.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot, Adam. So I we'll definitely give Adam time, but Adam's one of the panelists that we're going to have for the next 20, 30 minutes, depending on what the questions look like. So Adam will just if anyone has any questions, we'll just go ahead and transition on over into this panel discussion.
Sounds great to me.
Thanks so much. All right, folks. So right now, as far as the panel discussion, all the speakers that you heard here, and additionally, Matt Brim, and we've already heard from Dr. Dave, but Dave and Bill Lynch, all of these are members of the OAA, and they're either interested in buying tadpoles or they're interested in selling tadpoles. And then, of course, we have Kevin Kayle just presented with the Ohio Division of Wildlife. We have quite a few folks, quite a few attendees here that are, pond and lake management companies themselves, as well as with some other folks. So if anyone has questions, feel free to chime in. I definitely have a few written down here that I can ask too, if there's any lull.
I guess I just wanted to follow up with one comment following Adam's talk, and is that as typically the tadpole sources are in the spring when people are clearing out their hatchery ponds and that type of thing. And so for us to be able to sell to garden ponds or to educators, schools, and universities throughout the season, throughout the summer, we keep them in cold water tanks, flow-through tanks, to slow down their metamorphosis. And so that really works pretty easily. Again, these are aerated tanks like Adam was saying, but they're just using well water to keep those guys held back so they don't change into frogs too soon, because they tend to get away.
That's a good point, Dave. That's something I was thinking with Adams, was once you guys have them held up, whether they're in tanks or vats or whatever, really how long, obviously we want to bring them in a perfect world, move them out immediately, but how long do they hold well in something like that? So that's good to know. You chill them down, Dave. They've done really well for you.
Yep.
Matt, if you don't mind, we'll hold them for 4 to 6 weeks with no issues. Once we get them purged of the mud, and that population actually holds quite well. We feed a floating 1/8 inch, 3.5 millimeter, 35.5 Ziegler pellet. Nothing too fancy. By the time we have them tanked at our holding facility, we're no longer trying to grow them. We're just trying to sustain them and keep them healthy, right? And it's no problem holding them for a pretty long period of time. We're not trying to make pets out of them, of course, but the way the tadpole business has worked is, you can't just go pick up a bucket every week. You're stuck bringing in tadpoles when somebody's harvesting a pond. So you
Right.
do have to acquire typically a large number of them, and then you're stuck holding on to them for a little while.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. Matt Brim, you had your hand held up earlier, and I asked you if you could hold off until the panel discussion. Go ahead if you like.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to clarify was with the aquaculture A permit, that allows you to sell tadpoles and other species as retail as well as wholesale. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, Matt.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
So Kevin, one question I was asked to ask was how are, and I work for the university, so I don't have a direct permit myself, but how are tadpoles added mid-year to their permit? So they've already selected what they want, and during the year, how do they get on and add that to their list?
That would just be as simple as probably just sending us a memo. You could probably do it on the online system by adding an attachment to your existing permit. But if you send us via email or regular mail to the district offices, a note that you want to add those species, as long as it doesn't change us from an A to a B, then it shouldn't be a problem. One of the things we did do this year with this change is, and it was something that we got just in time for January. If you go to the existing permits that are out there on the website, they're now just check boxes for frog adults and tadpoles. So you don't have to, in some previous machinations of those forms, you would have had to written them in, just like an additional species. But now we've got check boxes for frogs and tadpoles.
I'd like to comment on the new online forms. I really appreciate how easy it is to use. It's great. I only have one small complaint, and that is the requirement that you can't renew until 30 days or less before it expires.
Yeah.
And so, I have a permit that I've got my calendar set, my watch and my phone set to remind me to re-up on a couple of my permits here in a month or so, because I couldn't do them, before the start of this year.
Right.
I don't know why that was in there, but I would, it'd be nice to get them all calendar year, but before the busy season starts and I go, oh my God, I forgot this because we were so busy with everything else.
That's a good point, Dave. And some of that is driven by our third-party vendor that manages this for us. One of the things we're doing now with our regular fishing and hunting licenses is an auto renewal. So you check a box and it'll automatically renew the permit for you. Maybe at some point in time as we develop these products, we could have an auto renewal for our permits as well, as long as nothing's being changed from one year to the other. So, no, thanks for the info. I can pass that on, but it's our third-party vendor that we're having to deal with.
It really is. It is a nice setup. I really like the way it's running though.
Yeah, and if you've got comments or you find bugs or occasionally the system goes down when you're trying to apply or renew, let us know, because it's pretty much all managed by that third party. So we have to get in there and communicate with them that there are issues. So we're constantly meeting with that third party vendor. Actually, every week we have a meeting with them to make sure things are going right, to get their reports generated, and then make sure if there are fixes needed, like we had to do the updates real quick for the aquaculture forms and what you see online, to make sure that the process runs smoothly for our customers.
Thanks, Dave. So Kevin, I did have a question. You mentioned several times that farms that have a track record of having tadpoles being able to sell. I don't know. I guess again, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this Class A not being considered a true Class A. So if Luke Roy starts his operation here in Ohio and he's never once had tadpoles, but he wants to have tadpoles, what steps does he have to be able to get a frog on that farm and be able to sell it just as normal?
If he's
Because
got
he doesn't have a track record.
If he's got production ponds and he goes and harvests his minnows and he's got a bunch of tadpoles
Mixed in there, and he decides, hey, let me see if I can find this market to sell tadpoles. I think that's fair grounds to be able to classify that under his Class A permit. And like you guys said, you wanted to add that on, you could do that. But the bigger issue would be whereas if Dr. Roy suddenly applies for a permit and the only source he has is a wildlife propagator's permit where he's importing frogs and tadpoles from Arkansas or Kentucky or wherever, then that's probably going to raise a red flag with our enforcement folks, that they'll want to be able to talk to him about where's his source of individuals for his culture program.
So if Dr. Roy wants to buy from Mr. Hader some tadpoles and then start his own thing, that's perfectly fine. It's a in-state aquaculture permit.
And just like we have with the other ones, then they're going to have a bill of sale from Adam in his operation and say, look, I was a customer and I got these frogs and tadpoles from in-state, released them into my culture ponds, and I'm going to sell them at some point in time later. Then, there's that track record that any inspector going in there to inspect a facility is going to be able to follow how he got those individuals on his facility.
And so
There's another important aspect to this. This is probably the only aquaculture species that if you build it, they will come. And they are coming from the wild, adjacent to your facility. And they are finding a wonderful place to explode their population.
Yeah.
So that's the way probably most, if not all, of our operations now have gotten their tadpoles and frogs into their farm. So they can't show a bill of sale. They just came and now they have established a population on their farm. So what's your take on that, Kevin?
No, and that's what we allowed the operations to be able to do, is to take those individuals that they're sort of incidental as part of the harvest process.
So that was part of your established track record or something like that? Is that where that comes in?
Yep.
Okay. So for the new guy on the block that's building ponds out in the middle of Putnam County with nothing around, he's going to have to go to somebody that sells him Ohio stock.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds simple.
And we know it's much more difficult than that.
Thanks, Kevin, because I did have on the ODW's website there's it says allow the aquaculture appropriate operation to take naturally occurring bullfrogs. It doesn't say anything about buying from Adam and culturing on my farm, and then I raise my own tadpoles up into frogs so I can have my own stock. The only language says there was naturally, and that's not correct.
And we would, like I said, we've got that sort of chain of custody for sales.
Certainly, as let's say Adam would buy from Matt or from Bill, or Dave would buy from Matt or Bill, and then turn around and sell them to somebody else who may want to do the same thing, just start his own operation. We need to be able to prove that there's that chain of custody there. Otherwise, we're going to run afoul with the law of folks buying from an out-of-state processor and then turning around and having that culture. So, but yeah, for right now, the path there is harvesting what's on your property or bring them in, letting them go, and then having that path of culture on your facilities. So.
Thanks so much. And for all of the attendees, again, I don't see open questions, but feel free to chat. I've got 9 people on my screen. Kevin's in the middle. It kind of feels like the Brady Bunch, and we're berating. and obviously that's not it. We just have new regulation changes. So we're trying to make sure that, everything's crystal clear, because everyone wants to do things on the up and up. But if you do have questions, please definitely either raise your hand, and I think we can unmute you to ask it directly, or ask in the Q&A. It looks like Adam Hayter has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Question for Kevin. Hey, I was at a local aquarium store this past weekend with my children, and had big sale on tadpoles, $2.49 per animal there. Are they regulated under Class A aquaculture, or is that a propagator's permit, or is it the Wild West when it comes to the pet shop business?
Yeah, when it comes to the pet shop business, because they're hobby trades, it's a lot different. But on the other hand, too, you'll find out that a lot of those operations do have aquaculture and wildlife propagator permits. So, yeah, it's a little bit different on the regulatory side of things, but we find out that they're actually being good players on the permit side of things. So,
sure. Well, I like the word hobby. A lot of tadpole sales, Kevin, go to hobbyists that maybe have a 50-gallon or 200-gallon water garden on their patio or in their backyard. And I think even in the pet shop business, I would speculate that a lot of those tadpoles are probably not going into aquariums, they're probably going into water gardens there. So I would love to see some type of hobbyist exemption going forward, so we could sell legally to the water garden folks, because I'm sure that those pet shops are not buying Ohio tadpoles this week. Those are probably coming from outside the state, if I had to imagine.
okay.
And I'm not giving you the pet shop name. It's my favorite pet shop on earth.
No, I'm making a note of that, Adam, because it's probably could be any pet shop anywhere in the state. So
I think you're right there. Yeah.
And again, it's this issue of a Class A species having a source limitation. That's the real kicker.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, do we really care? I mean, the people that were arguing strongly that this is a vector for disease transmission, well, pick a species. That is possible. We have other things in place to control and test for and make sure that we don't spread diseases around. I mean, this is not unique to tadpoles. And so a lot of those issues, I'm hoping that I know what this is about, Kevin, but in the next couple of years, we can get away from that, because it just is not really helpful and not helping anybody, really.
Yeah,
not conservation wise or anything.
And it's sort of the hurdle, the barrier that we had to put in place right now, knowing that at some point in time, we'd like to evaluate it and possibly remove it if we can.
You're the man.
And regarding that, obviously, I'm not going to speak for the Ohio Department of Ag, but I asked them, because of these changes, were they going to consider any fish health certifications required? And they said the same stuff that's always been done, because of the pathogens that are out there that some folks are concerned about are so ubiquitous. They were not going to, unless there were reasons presented, they were perfectly content with allow things to go as they are currently going, even though Division of Wildlife decided to change things up.
And the stakeholders presented some information about pathogens that could cross the bridge between amphibians and fish. And until we see and evaluate whether or not that's a real issue, that'll be one of the things we're looking at over the course of the next year or two that might help us change that regulation as well. Because if it's not happening, or isn't a big issue for either states that are bringing
product into the state of Ohio or within the state of Ohio. If it's not an issue in either of those cases, then it's not going to be a barrier for import.
Thanks, Kevin. I do have someone who wanted to raise or has their hand raised, so I'm gonna allow them to talk. It's Ken. And I see he just put it in the chat, but Ken, I'm gonna allow you to chat and ask your question. And then when you're done, I'll mute you and let the folks respond.
All right, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Ken.
Awesome. Hey, it sounds like some of the bigger players in aquaculture in the state need some state Ohio sourced tadpoles and such. So in that meantime, it opens an opportunity up for those of us looking to get into this and build a supply chain relationship. So if that were to happen, like Jones and Freshwater, if you guys were to be buying, when, what, how would somebody like me, a small shop, get into a business relationship with you folks to start supplying you as a vertical supply? That make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does, Ken. I'm gonna mute you just so there's not inadvertent talking, but for sure you can respond. I'll let Adam and Dave go ahead.
Well, yeah, just give us a call. I mean, that's, you know where to reach me or Adam, that's for sure. Definitely interested.
Ken, absolutely. I mean, we're easy to get a hold of. Website, email, whatever. Any folks here that answer the phone will definitely direct you to myself or our production team. We absolutely want to support the Ohio Aquaculture Association and its growers. We absolutely need a source here within the state. We do not have the production capability at this time to produce enough tadpoles for ourselves here on our own farm. Ponds are all full of sunfish and bass. So we're definitely looking for help with this. You know, we have the immediate need for 1,000 pounds of tadpoles. Okay. We start hauling fish March 1st, and that season is not over until 4th of July weekend. And whether that's all in one shot or whether that's broke up in 2 or 3 shots, we're looking about 1,000 pounds of animals during that 3-4 month stretch there. So.
Is that total or per week? And so March 1st is, did you say that was per week?
No, Ken, that would be for the spring season.
All right. Good. So 1,000 pounds, March 1st, things are going to start ramping up, and it goes through like a curve where it gets crazy and then slows down after Memorial Day. Good. So that was it. You gave me time. Would that something you folks would pick up, or is that something I'd have to make arrangements to deliver? You know, when you're doing deliveries, I'm up in Northeast to the other side of the state from you guys, but is that something you're willing to work on doing you know, you're making deliveries up this way, swing by and grab them if it's convenient? How would the logistics work on that?
In our case, we could definitely pick them up.
Yeah, I think we all get around the state as we've tried to support more and more of our Ohio fish growers in general. So I think that's a strong possibility for any of the people that are selling quantities like Jones and Freshwater Farms are.
Cool. Thanks.
The only thing I would add is that our season for the tadpoles, because we do sell for a lot of garden ponds and schools and things, really continues all the way through November.
All right. Thanks, Ken. I appreciate it. I do see here that there's another question about for the folks who do buy, what testing is required, even if it's just tadpoles and if it's not required by the Ohio Division of Wildlife, or I'm sorry, the Department of Ag. Adam and Dave, you guys do need any tests, or are you good if you're buying from somebody?
We require VHS testing on all fish that enter the farm, but nothing on tadpoles at this time. brings up a little concern with contaminants with inside a crop of tadpoles. You know, if we're going to see contaminants of, say, minnows or sunfish or something like that, we probably want to see VHS certification on those contaminants there. But the tadpoles themselves, no health regs is that I'm aware of.
All right, great. Dave, do you want to chime, or you good?
Yeah, well, certainly what he said, but usually people are able to sort those out. So we already have them sorted. So there's been no need for that with the tadpoles. The other thing I might point out to the newbies out there that really the prime thing to have in the spring is actually the second season tadpoles. Obviously, they were not hatched in the spring. These are ones that were grown the previous summer. So, it really is kind of like a 1.5 year cycle for bullfrogs in general. So that they're not going to really turn into big frogs until that second summer.
Thanks a lot. So Matt Brim, I'm gonna pick on you. I know you've got a little interest. I shared a little thing on your split pond. I talked a little bit about, even I showed Dave and Matt's holding tanks there. What are your thoughts on tadpole production with Brim's Perch Farm?
My thoughts are I'm excited to not throw away tadpoles anymore. For years, we just tossed buckets of them out into the field. For years after that, we've left the buckets sitting tank side, and one of our neighbors that has his fishing pond, he comes over and gets the buckets, and they just kind of disappear. He puts them in his pond. We don't charge him anything for it, and so yeah, we're looking for the welcome opportunity to take something that we spend time sorting and getting out of our perch, and actually turn that into something more than fertilizer. One of my questions I had for Dave and Adam, when you guys are buying, are you looking to buy by the weight, like by pound? Are you buying individually, by the gallon? What are you guys looking for when you're purchasing?
Well, up to this point in the last 10 years or so, it's always been by the piece. And the price, even from when we had to go to Indiana or out of state sources for these, the price has been creeping up every year, even though they still throw away buckets and buckets, at those facilities. So I don't think we're having any trouble selling them at a very good price by the piece.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, they're bought by the head, they're getting a head count per pound, and then of course weighing them onto the truck, right? Just so you don't have to count 10,000 animals that day. But we're buying them by the head.
Okay. And yeah, so with our split ponds, I'm kind of excited because we have noticed, obviously with no fish in those ponds, and being that we only have perch on our farm pretty much exclusively, we have a bass show up every once in a while. We have an abundance of tadpoles sometimes, and so anybody that's thinking of doing a split pond type system, or even looking into maybe pond side tanks, something like that, that's something for you to think about as a possible little extra money on the side. Tadpoles soak up some of that excess nutrients, and that's something that you can pull out of the pond and remove a large chunk of biomass at a time. That way, reduce some of the biomass load in your pond system. So we're looking forward to trying to cultivate some of those numbers of tadpoles in the future here.
And just to bring you information for your next webinar, the only thing I can think of better that you could stock in that split pond are the common species of freshwater mussel that we need to get the DNR to authorize, so that we can be more ecologically efficient and have something else that we can improve other people's ponds. Anyway.
I've actually worked with Dr. Michael Hogarth at Otterbein University in the past, and I've talked to him every now and then about the possibility of using mussels as a little bit of a filtration / bycatch type of an animal. Be interesting to see how that worked out, whether they would benefit a lot or whether they would just add excess ammonia and nitrogen waste to the system.
I think I can answer that in no. I mean, that's why salmon farms are looking at mussel culture around the cages and things like that, because they actually improve the water quality. I think that's pretty well established, and why people are looking at multi-trophic things. Anyway, but we don't want Kevin to get bored, right, Kevin?
Next job for you, Kevin.
Always a new angle.
All right, I don't see another question here. I know we're not all going to figure out because again, Class A, not technically treated as normal Class A. We're still going to have questions outside of this presentation. Again, this is all recorded for folks to go back and listen to what Kevin said during his presentation, as well as his responses to what was asked here to the several questions. So it's not meant to be all encompassing, but should be a good starting place for a lot of folks. But I'd certainly encourage everybody to reach out to myself as well as Kevin here. Kevin, you had your email address on your screen. But maybe Kevin, you are going to be a hot topic one. You might want to put your email address down in the chat and make sure it goes to panelists and attendees so that the attendees can see your email address there.
We'll do that.
I've got one other question for Matt. It looks like you probably also saw it, Matt Brim. It is in the chat box and went to all panelists and attendees. So Steven asked you to maybe contact him at his Gmail account there. So I don't want to take up time there, but it's there. And Kevin just posted his.
That's my email and my phone number. So
great. Okay, so I don't want to cut us off, but I don't see any more questions being asked. Everyone has everything's kind of slow.
Ken McPherson has his hand up.
Ken already chatted, but here I'll ask him to unmute again. Let him chat if he wants to chat.
Didn't take my hand down. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, no problem, Ken. Okay, so again, let me share. Actually, I don't guess I really have it to share. So, oh yeah, here we go. So as a reminder, if you are an OAA member, you'll be entered to draw for a t-shirt after each virtual Saturday workshop. And then let me pull up the sponsors one, because this is another important thing for us to see, that during the drive, which we have right now, sorry guys, sharing my screen right here. During this drive, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this, is to drive up some membership and get folks to remember to actually do their membership, because normally everyone redoes their membership for the following year when they sign up for the conference. There's no conference to sign up for, so we got to have a way to make sure folks sign up, and of course during COVID give folks a little bit of break. So if you are interested, for sure sign up for your 2021 and 2022 membership. Save $25. It's only $50 a year normally. And then Jenny, I'm going to let you specify on if you sign up during this membership drive, which it does end February 28th. I do want her to quickly state what you could win if you do enter in during this time.
So if you join OAA at this time under the special, we will be having some special drawings right before the 2022 conference. you could win either free conference registration, polo shirts, embroidered OAA polo shirts, fleece vests, or t-shirts. So there's a certain number that'll be picked in each category, but what would be really well worth it is the free conference registration. So, and you will be notified during the conference. So you would go ahead and register for the conference, pay the fee, and then we would reimburse you when we announce the winners of those.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. It's just ohioaquaculture.org, and there is the QR code. If you just open up the photo, the camera on your phone, you can scan that and it'll take you right to it. All right, everybody, we went about 15 minutes over, but we're gonna go ahead and end this. It will be recorded, or it has been recorded, and my email it'll be on my website, and I will share that with Aqua Ohio, probably not SC Aquaponics, but Aqua Ohio and the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center listserv. And then I'm sure that the Ohio Aquaculture Association will share that on their member listserv. But we'll get it up online. It will take a little bit to extract this because this was a little bit of a long webinar, and it will take a little time to get up there. But everyone will be notified once it is up. Join the OAA, get on to our Aqua Ohio and SC Aquaponics listservs. Contact me if you have questions on that, because I do send out a lot of pertinent information, such as this webinar right here.
Matt, I have one more thing. The participant that in the drawing for today, I will contact you by email to get information on where to send your shirt.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jenny. All right, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thanks so much for everyone. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.